Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 2nd of February. In today's video, we're primarily focusing on the Donetsk front, including Velyka Novosilka, Novomykhailivka, Avdiivka, and several other localities. We're also going to look at the end at the sinking of the missile corvette Ivanovets. But let's begin by looking at Velyka Novosilka. Just some background, if you recall in my last video, I talked about the 23rd Mechanized Brigade was moved from its positions just to the north of Prutny. A Ukrainian unit that was defending over here moved to the northern flank of Avdiivka. And if you recall, going back to, I believe, October of last year, that's when you had the 35th and 36th Marine Brigades that were operating in this part of the front line moved away in favor of offensive activities in Kherson. And so the replacements are mainly territorial defense units. You can see some of them on the map actually. You have this one, for instance, and this one is more important for today's video, the 127th Kharkiv Territorial Defense Brigade. And so you can see the shift in priorities with the Ukrainians going on a defensive footing and redirecting some of their higher quality units to other parts of the front line for more important defensive work or for offensive work. So with the Ukrainians focusing elsewhere, the Russian forces took advantage and began to really gain the initiative on this part of the front line. Not anything too significant in terms of gains, but there were positional advances. And this really came to a head on January 29th, when it's likely that the Ukrainians were in the process of rotating their forces on a local level around some of their defenses, including this ravine over here. And so as the Ukrainians were doing this, the Russian forces took advantage. They launched a pretty large barrage of artillery fire, FPV strikes, and drones that dropped grenades onto Ukrainian groupings in their deployment points and as they were rotating forces. And so this was the beginning of the Russian offensive activity in the region, which was geolocated on the 29th of January, showing Russia's 143rd Motor Rifle Regiment storming Ukrainian positions, taking them over in firefights, including in the area around this ravine, which serves as Ukraine's forward-most defensive area. At the same time, you also had Russia's 25th CBRN Regiment, which is attached to the 5th Combined Arms Army, and they had a large barrage of their own of TOS-1A shelling in the area a bit to the east or to the northeast of Prutny, located over here. So there was significant artillery preparation in the area. And then on January 30th, Russian and Ukrainian sources alike reported a Russian armored attack that was led by the 218th Tank Regiment in the area north of Prutny. As a result of those assaults, the Russians were able to get control of additional fields and Ukrainian fortifications in the region, pushing back the Ukrainians several hundred meters north to their current forward positions in the ravine. These Russian assaults are largely being led by several tanks that are advancing in one column, sometimes aided by BMPs, on which you have infantry that dismount, and then those infantry dismounts are essential in storming the Ukrainian positions, and they are supported by the tank fire. So besides the area enclosed in the red perimeter being captured, on the 31st of January, additional footage was released showing Russia's 60th Motor Rifle Brigade launching a company-sized assault, and this included a rather large armored column. And the thing is, I've seen some claims that this video was actually recorded in the fall, around early October. I can't verify that, but because it was released recently and it's from the same sector, I'm going to still cover it and show the geolocation. So the Russian mechanized assault, it's pretty much east of Prutny. It was a very large armored assault, so a combined effort of tanks, BMPs, MTLBs, and I believe it was two main battle tanks that were really supporting the rest of the infantry fighting vehicles in the assault. So really the video shows the work of three Russian platoons. One of the platoons takes its way to the right along this vector of attack and clears out the Ukrainian defenders over there, with infantry dismounting and engaging with the Ukrainian forces, pushing them out. That secures the flank and allows the other two platoons to advance further north and clear out the Ukrainians from this position over here on this arrow. And they were supported by fire from the armored fighting vehicles before those vehicles withdrew, as the Russian forces with their actual ground forces solidified control over these areas. And so this may be old because this part of the map was previously marked under Russian control in my mapping, but it does still show generally how the Russian forces do have more freedom of movement with less vehicular casualties. Obviously, there are still some, but there is less in this part of the front line compared to other areas that we're going to look at today, which does show a difference in Ukrainian priorities. But despite what I just said, the Ukrainian 127th Territorial Defense Division of Brigade, they have showcase footage showing at least some of the targets of the Russian vehicles that are advancing. There was one column of 8 vehicles that was advancing north of Prutny that came under target from this brigade, and this came from a combined effort of ATGMs, artillery, and FPV drones, which did lead to damage to several vehicles and several confirmed casualties. But as a whole, when you compare the video that was released by the 127th to the wider Russian assaults, most of them have actually been successful in this case. An area where Russia's armored assaults was less successful is in the area to the southwest of Novomykhailivka, where the Russian forces recently have been increasing pressure. This is an interesting area to attack. I believe personally this is being done in order to first of all overrun Ukrainian fortifications on the flank of the Russian salient that has developed to the south of Novomykhailivka, but it also is important because the Russian forces are trying to reach this road that leads from Kostiantynivka to Vuhledar. It is an important supply road for the Ukrainians near the front line, so the Russian forces want to get a more direct line of fire on it and potentially even capture it themselves. That would be the rationale behind launching such a large armored assault, which does rival the scale of the assault that I described in the Velyka Novosilka sector. And so in this case, the 72nd Brigade, their Bulava drone group, they spotted the Russian assault pretty quickly, and they responded with a large FPV barrage, which led to direct hits on at least 3 Russian tanks, 7 MTLBs, and 1 BMP-2, with additional armored fighting vehicles being abandoned. So all in all, this armored assault, which was geolocated to this area over here, with most of the advances occurring along this direction with these attack arrows, it led to 15 Russian losses. And it could be said that by virtue of those losses being located further west, that there was a Russian advance that amounts to 1 or 2 kilometers, but it's not really solid control and it isn't enough to reach the road or the Ukrainian fortifications located in these ravines over there. But nonetheless, there was a very significant Russian artillery barrage targeting this place in particular. So we're gonna have to see if Russia continues with those same assaults. But as the Russians were south of Novomykhailivka, they were able to make gains northeast of the village, gaining further control over heights that are overlooking the valley on which the Ukrainian defensive positions in Novomykhailivka are located. And as you can see, due to this Russian advance, they've been able to capture this additional area, which includes control leading into this road that actually enters into the easternmost part of Novomykhailivka. And again, the elevation is important. So the Russians do continue slowly chipping away at the Ukrainian defensive positions on this northern flank, as admitted by Deep State on the 30th of January. Additionally, the Russians launched armored assaults north of Horlivka through the open fields in the direction of Ukraine's forward defensive nodes, which include this tree line over here and this tree line marked in blue. And so this armored assault was in the end futile. Most of the armored fighting vehicles that were involved and the tanks were abandoned at the area where I have the red advance marked. So that would be the extent of the Russian attack. And then those vehicles were targeted by the Ukrainian drone operators, I believe from the 46th Air Assault Brigade, where they dropped grenades using the drones into the hatches of those tanks or whatever openings were possible. Looking at southern Avdiivka, over the past couple of days, the Russian forces have continued their advances just to the west of the Zenit's abandoned air defense battalion. And so they took over this land in recent days, while the Ukrainians do still hold on to the actual base, although their flanks are being chipped away at, and the roads and the Ukrainian positions leading into the Zenit position have been targeted significantly by Russian forces. There's been a significant increase in recent days in the artillery output, not just on the Zenit base, but also on this road, the T-005 road leading from Avdiivka towards those Ukrainian defenses. Also at these dachas marked in blue, where the Ukrainians are currently holding up. A lot of them that withdrew from this residential quarters retreated into that direction and are now being pummeled by Russian artillery, as shown in some satellite imagery, and also all this area around this rail line where there are Ukrainian trenches that have been built up over the past couple of years. Those are being targeted by the Russian artillery. And really, over these past few days, we've seen a shift with the Ukrainian sources gradually admitting that the Russian forces have larger and larger control over this residential quarter. At the moment, I wouldn't say that they have 100% control over this residential quarter, as this region could still be considered a gray zone, but the Russian forces have largely solidified control over the easternmost part. The last remaining Ukrainian resistance really comes from tanks that are either belonging to the 116th or 47th Mechanized Brigades that were recently moved into this region that conduct raids onto the Russian positions along Kolosova Street, for instance, running through the center of the residential quarter. And then they engage with the Russians within those houses before withdrawing. And so there is some footage of that from the northwestern corner, but that's about it. Since the the Russians broke through the Ukrainian defenses in southern Avdiivka around the 18th of January, there has been some ambiguity about the section of the residential areas just to the west of the Russian controlled industrial district. And now we finally have confirmation that this area that I have marked in blue is still under Ukrainian control, based on a new video that has been released by the Viking drone group, which corrected shelling on the Ukrainian positions in these houses that are very close to the forested area and to the industrial district on Kolosova Street. And this could actually be traced back to this unit over here, Hateful Eight drone units, which was previously operating around Kherson, also goes by the name Viking. And so now they have certain elements with their FPV drones hitting Ukrainian positions within the residential parts of Avdiivka. And lastly, we have a video from the 29th of January that was geolocated to an area within this forested portion to the north of the industrial zone. And this shows a Russian infantry assault that cleared out Ukrainian positions in dugouts that are located within the wooded area. And so the Russian forces advanced northwards from their positions around Yastovitsky Lane and took over those areas. And this clearing operation in the forest will take a pretty long time. As you can see, the Ukrainian forces have put in resources and have dug in within this forested region. And it's an area that's being shelled heavily by the Russians. And it's an area that, for the most part, they haven't focused on taking over as much, as they've been putting most of their resources into the assaults going on further south. And as we're about to get into, there's also assaults going on further north. So just for some background on northern Avdiivka, throughout the month of January, we've been covering this extensively. While in the early weeks of January, the Avdiivka front was relatively silent, an area that continued to see ongoing bombardment and attempts at advances and some positional gains was northern Avdiivka. And we saw those Russian advances occurred in the area south of Kamyanka. So Kamyanka was used as a springboard for Russian attacks. In the process, they were able to get control of this region over here in the direction of this key height over here located on this landfill. This was just one example of the Russian advance. Another Russian advance occurred in the fields located to the west of Kamyanka. And so the Russian forces launched attacks along this road in particular, where you see the red arrow marked from the west, but also from the north, from positions around this hamlet over here called Vesele. So from there, the Russian forces with their armored columns and infantry had dismounted, took over additional positions in trenches, and ended up solidifying control over this particular road that you see the arrows going horizontally marked at. And that particular road connects between the Russian groupings in Kamyanka and the ones that are operating around the dachas in northern Avdiivka. And so another significant Russian push has been occurring in these dachas. So the Russian forces spent a lot of January just solidifying control over the northernmost dachas. There were several Ukrainian counterattacks where they actually were successful in taking back positions. So there was also significant amount of FPV drones the Ukrainians sent the Russians' way. But eventually the Russians were able to solidify control, not over the dachas only, but also over the filtration station over here, which was used by the Russians as another springboard to advance further south. And so the Russian forces solidified control and advanced further south, as is now indicated by geolocated footage. So on January 27th, there was a Russian armed assault that occurred in the fields west of Kamyanka, where there has been a lot of Russian activity recently. And in this particular instance, FPV drones were utilized by the Ukrainians, specifically the Flying Skull unit, the Falcon Avengers units, and elements of the 110th Mechanized Brigade, which is important to keep that in mind because 110th is also defending on the southern section of Avdiivka, but they also have significant resources in the northern part of the city. And so in this particular case, they were able to repel the tanks and BMPs that were advancing generally along this road. But at the same time, these FPV drones, these units, they release footage from the Dacha area on the 1st of February, which showed 9 FPV drone strikes on Russian forces within various houses. And once the geolocations were done, we got confirmation the Russian forces were able to significantly penetrate the Ukrainian lines compared to where we previously thought the front lines were located. And so we had this one geolocated video, and the other geolocated marker was located even further south. So not only did the Russian forces get full control over the dachas that are located north of Avdiivka within this rectangle, but they were actually able to push past that portion and penetrate into the northernmost sections of the residential areas of Avdiivka itself within this blue marker, which shows the Ukrainian FPV strike on the Russian forward groupings. Really, this advance of about 1.5 kilometers indicates that the Russian forces, their enhanced pressure over the month of January eventually led to a breaking point, which allowed the Russian forces to make these gains in quick succession in these areas that were rather fortified by the Ukrainians, as previously the Ukrainians fought house to house in these dachas, which contributed to the slow pace. But it seems like once they reached a breaking point, the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw within or pat away from these dachas and into the residential sections of the city itself. And at the same time, they were likely forced to abandon their flanks, which includes these open fields in between Kamyanka and the dachas. And so the new Ukrainian forward line is largely around the tree lines located to the north of the Avdiivsky quarry and the landfill located over here, which is a major Ukrainian current staging position used for reconnaissance that overlooks the entirety of the city of Avdiivka. So that's also a key target that Russia could potentially go for in the future, and they are relatively close to it. But now, just for another takeaway, the Russian forces do have a vector of attack to actually begin putting pressure onto the center of Avdiivka within the actual residential districts, and they are now significantly closer to some of the supply lines that are being used to help continue the reinforcements and resupply and rotation of the groupings within Avdiivka. As right now, when you compare the forwardmost Russian position, it is about 1.5 kilometers away from the road supplying Avdiivka. And finally, on the night of the 28th of January, the Ukrainian forces restarted their attacks to the west of Horlivka, taking over a trench that is located 1.3 kilometers away from the Ukrainian fortifications that were built in 2014 during the Donbass War. And so this geolocated marker shows that the 225th Battalion of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade was involved in this operation. And if you recall, 127th was also involved earlier in fighting around Velyka Novosilka. So battalions are split up individually into different parts of the front line. This particular battalion was involved in support of artillery, including cluster munitions, in clearing out a Russian trench that is located over here if you zoom in. And so that occurred with the infantry engaging in firefights and eventually pushing out the Russian forces. And so this was the only attack that was reported on this entire front. If you recall, in December or November, I believe it was, when the Russians, or the Ukrainians, began their attacks in this direction, they were launching attacks to the east of Pivdenie or on various landfills and slag heaps that are located to the northeast of Pivdenie. And so we haven't seen a resumption of hostilities in that direction where the Russian forces were able to stabilize the line and take back much of the positions that the Ukrainians were able to initially take over. But at least in this one particular instance, the Ukrainians were able to advance in this trench over there. And one last thing of importance to note is that in previous operations, the 24th Mechanized Brigade was involved in assaulting the Russian positions around Horlivka. But now we're not seeing them involved. We're seeing a territorial defense unit take up and fill that void, which is a decrease in quality, as we're seeing the 24th defending around the Bakhmut front. And so in terms of the significance of such an assault, just when we think about it, of course there is a PER value to advancing in this direction. And then just my own personal theory is that perhaps the Ukrainians would be trying to at least put some pressure onto Horlivka, which is a supply node that leads all the way into the area around Avdiivka that's being used for logistical support for the Russian offensive over there. But just based on the scale of the Ukrainian attacks and the fact that they're not even using a mechanized unit, the fact that they're using a territorial defense unit, and not even the full one, just a single battalion, it does indicate that those attacks in scale are not even close enough to even make a change in the logistical situation. And lastly, on the 1st of February, there was an unmanned surface vessel attack targeting the Project 1241 Molnia class missile corvette vessel called the Ivanovets, specifically within this Lake Donuslav. And this attack occurred roughly at this geolocation. Just to briefly mention their specific armaments, this missile corvette is armed with two anti-ship launchers that can fire two of the P-100 Mosquito anti-ship missiles at a time. Additionally, they either have the Igla 1 or Storla 3 man-pad systems, and they have on board what is estimated to be 16 surface-to-air missiles. At the same time, they also have one 76mm AK-176M naval gun that has 314 rounds on board. They have a fire control radar to coordinate such attacks using the naval gun, and they have two 30mm AK-630M rotary cannons. The ship can track 15 airborne or seaborne targets at a time, and then can target them with supersonic anti-ship missiles with a range of around 130 kilometers. In addition, the ship has radar jamming capabilities, and really in general, the anti-ship missiles could be used to attack surface vessels in the Black Sea, especially around Ukraine's coast. Here we have some footage that was released from Ukraine's SBU unit Group 13, which was the unit responsible for carrying out this specific attack. And as you can see, and as was reported by the Ukrainian side, they attacked with 6 Mangura V5 and unmanned surface vessels, which have the capability of carrying 320 kilograms of explosives, with Ukrainian sources actually claiming that the ship suffered 6 direct hits into the hull, which eventually caused the ship to roll astern and eventually sink. The attack was resisted by the crew, as we can see in some of these videos how there is fire directed towards the direction of the unmanned surface vessels, but this was not enough to stop the destruction that eventually led to the sinking of the ship. And then in terms of the casualties, I don't want to give a number because there isn't any concrete information. It is said that for this crew to be in full operation, there needs to be 41 sailors aboard, and I've seen estimates that range from really about 39 to 45 actual crewmen being on board at the time. And currently there's still rescue and searching missions ongoing in this region, so until we get the final word about that, we don't have a confirmed number for the amount of killed or wounded. Looking into some of the significance of the strike, the Ivanovets was one of 3 vessels in its specific class, and I can't verify if this is true because I saw it spreading on mainstream media and I couldn't find the original source for it, but it's being claimed that the vessel had a worth of $60 to $70 million. This once again highlights the Ukrainians' ability to get accurate reconnaissance of the naval positions, all the assets that the Russians have in their Black Sea fleet, both due to their own reconnaissance missions that include using UAVs, but also due to support that's being given, substantial support actually, from satellites and UAVs that are coming from NATO nations that's being provided to Ukraine that allows them to then plan their course of action accordingly, utilizing these unmanned surface vessels. And really, that's been an innovation that the Ukrainians have undertaken during the entire course of this war with some support, especially from the British. And so in this particular case, we can see how the Ukrainians were able to launch what appears to be 6 of such vessels, presumably from the coast, although even that I can't say with 100% certainty, but from somewhere in the northwestern section of the Black Sea. and make it all the way into the Russian territorial waters without being detected or at least being intercepted by the Russian side, and then making their way all the way to the lake itself that's already within Crimea and successfully sinking such a significant naval asset for the Russian side, which does have the capability to strike naval targets and also ground targets 130 kilometers in stretch and distance. But in all honesty, since the collapse of the grain deal, the Russian forces have not focused on targeting the grain corridor that the Ukrainians have been using for international vessels to navigate their way through the Black Sea, especially in the westernmost portion of the sea, to reach the Ukrainian ports and then make their way in and out. And so, since the collapse of the grain deal, we've seen 500 vessels that have transited and conducted their trade. And so the Russian forces likely aren't doing this due to the international repercussions that would be caused by attacking the foreign merchant vessels. So in this particular case, the Ukrainian attacks on these Russian ships don't really have an effect on that. They could just have a broader effect on the amount of resources the Russian forces put from their Black Sea fleets in the westernmost sections of Crimea that do have an extended range reaching into the western parts of the Black Sea and into Ukrainian actual land territory. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.